critical analysis. So why are we talking about wealth? Why are we not talking about class? Or why are we not talking about poor people? I think there is some context. I will briefly talk about it. And I think there is something new that happens in the world after the end of Cold War. And all of us sitting here in India, we know how India began to change in 1990s, and new liberal reform produced a different kind of imagination about what kind of futures we will have and how should we organize not only our personal life, not our economic life, but also our personal lives, our intimate lives, our hobbies, what we like, what we don't like, and all that in some sense begins to change. So this new liberal was kind of, also consumption revolution as we all talk about, and many things then begin to happen. Most of us have mobile phones in our hand and we are addicted to them. And then mobile phone addiction is not simply something that has happened because of psychological reasons. There's a whole historical and political process underlying this kind of obsession with the kind of media we have, the kind of messages that we get. So I think there is something new in capitalism. Even when we talk about rich and poor in the sense of wealth and capital, I think post 90s there is something new, and this new is both in terms of the reality of wealth and reality of being rich and poor, but also in terms of narratives. And I think the narrative starts with Thomas Piketty's book. All of you would have heard about capitalism or capital in the 21st century, where he begins to actually count how much wealth who has. And there's a new discourse of 1% versus the 99%, 10% versus the 90%, or now we talk about 0.001% versus the 60%. The kind of wealth concentration that has happened was unprecedented. And I think that was a very, very important point to start, and that's how this book becomes kind of globally very, very important, and it kind of opens up new areas of research. But it also begins to raise questions about inequalities of wealth. That it's not simply about some people having a lot of wealth, but it is also about the 60% or 90% or below 40%. So there all that also brings question of inequality back to the center stage in global policy circles, and we also begin to talk about it. It was very important, but there was something lacking in it. It was talking about wealth and inequality only through economic categories. So you can make a distinction between income and wealth. Income is flow, wealth is constant. You can also say that rich are becoming richer because they own wealth, because they have this house property prices go up, and incomes don't go up. So they gave explanations, but they were also suggesting something more, which perhaps needs to be done, and that's what we try to do in this. And that is that the moment you talk about wealth, the fact that we all talk about 1%, a 0.001% or 10% versus 90%, we are not simply talking about attributes. It's not question of my being of a particular age or particular body weight. It's also question of relationships. And that's where Lamakaan becomes very critical. What kind of relationships it produces among citizens of a given country or of the world. We don't live in countries any longer. We live in the world, and what happens in Brazil immediately affects us in some way or the other. So the wealth is also a new kind of global process. And this process is a relational process. And it is in this context that we began to think about the new narratives of wealth. So it is in this context that we thought, the framing of wealth was very, very critical. And if you look at just the COVID period, and it's very, very telling, and the point that was being made earlier also, that this whatever data we have available, in case of India, the number of people, for example, who earn less than $2 per day, those who are below poverty line, their number goes up by a significant proportion. And there is one estimate that says in 2020, 32 million people became poorer than before. They came into this bracket below $2. 32 million is a large number, right, in just 1 year. Likewise, we have been celebrating Indian middle class, expanding Indian middle class. And we know that middle class is shrinking, right? And this is now statistically happening, that number of people who are in middle class is shrinking not only in India, all over the world. And when middle class begins to shrink, it is something, middle class is not simply a class. Middle class is also a normative space. All of us who are educated, we want to be in the middle class. Middle class is a space of comfort. Middle class is a space where we can aspire, where we can get our children educated, and you can move around, you can be mobile both vertically, horizontally. So the developed countries, for example, Australia, had 94% people reporting that they are middle class. So there was nobody left who was really poor in those countries, maybe 1%, 2%, or 5%. In India also, people thought, there were like 20%, 30% people who were middle class, but there were another 30% who were aspirational middle class. And they were hoping, even if they were driving a vehicle, they thought that a child will study and he'll also become a doctor, and she will also become an engineer, and that would in some sense take them to the middle class. So this dream in a sense begins to shatter as neoliberal reforms expand, and COVID in some sense became an excuse. And this is exactly the time when the number of dollar billionaires begins to grow all over the world. And India is one of the classic case where the number of billionaires, we have two categories in India. One is dollar billionaires, and the other one is people who have more than 1,000 crores. And the number of those who own more than 1,000 crores goes up by more than 11 times, between 2012 and 2022. So in just 10 years, it goes up by 11 times. That means every year it's growing by a significant proportion. And this is not something which is kind of, just rich people becoming richer. Those who were not very rich, they also were becoming richer, because in India there's an exceptional kind of example that nearly 67% of those who are billionaires, who are 1,000 crore patis, they are self-made, in double quotes. I'll come to that point later on. So at some level, this in some sense becomes a very major reality. As I was talking about, it is not one-way process, it's a relational process. All these poor whose number is increasing, all the middle class that is shrinking, and the wealth that is expanding, it appears to be just numbers, but it is obviously a relational process. Somebody is taking money from my pocket, putting it in Purendra's pocket, and it doesn't happen without my knowledge. It happens with my knowledge, but the relationship is structured in a manner that wealth is being transferred structurally. So it's not like money is growing and these people are actually producing additional value. It's not old kind of capitalism. That also is happening perhaps in many ways, but there is something which kind of we thought, that's why wealth is not simply a question of rich and poor, question of elite and subaltern, question of being, crorepati and being struggling masses or middle class. It is a relational process of new kind of capitalism. So wealth also in some sense provides us a lens through which we can look at mobilities, we can look at who is what and who is shaping. That once you have these people who are billionaires, and if you have thousands of them, earlier there were 10 of them or 20 of them, and now there are 5,000 of them, then obviously they are the ones who would decide who is going to get elected. They are the ones who will decide whether India Forum will be able to function or not. Even if it is functioning, they will decide how through money, various news channels we were talking about, even the YouTube channels, they'll also now begin to kind of play this game, and money can come to them. I'll take another 5 to 7 minutes, 10 minutes, yeah. So in 90s or post-90s, India has seen a significant expansion of private wealth, and this is happening all across. Again, the way we look at it, I'll come to that. But there's another thing that is happening. What Ujitra was talking about, Ambani's wedding. Why was it coming in our drawing rooms? Why the hell are we interested in Ambani's wedding? You open your Instagram and you're looking at reels, and these kids are kind of showing off with their dresses. Why the hell are they doing this? Why are they spending so much money? This is not something which is just one-off. If you look at, and we have looked at how post 2000, there is a different kind of celebration of wealth, mainstreaming of wealth. Being wealthy is the in thing. And here I also want to say that in Indian culture, wealth is very deep. We are not anti-wealth, right? Wealth has a cultural value, and during this project, we kind of coined a new term. We call it small wealth and big wealth. Small wealth is somebody that all of us want to have. Even a person who is a Dalit landless laborer, she would also want to have some gold. And that's how we ensured our kind of future, some kind of, protection from market vagaries. And this is not something that happens in post-liberalization period. So small wealth, house ownership, we are desperate about that. So small wealth, and that at some level then connects to the way big wealth tries to celebrate itself. All of us get married, all of us want our children to have good weddings, and weddings becomes the occasion through which you would begin to create a new kind of cultural imagination of wealth, that how good it is. You have to be like that. You have to live up to that. This is how one must get married. Otherwise, my marriage is not so impressive. So young men and women begin to look up to that kind of thing, and that normalizes. It becomes a norm. It becomes the way to be. And again, this whole process of, and we worked on it, how after 2000s, there are new listings that emerge. You have this Forbes list, and there are magazines that are started in India. They were not there earlier, which begin to kind of, now these people have also become wealthy. These people have also become wealthy. There's a Hurun report every year, they publish 1,000 crores. And this is a country where wealth is actually very elusive, right? Particularly in South India, nobody will tell you how much wealth they have. They'll all hide wealth, or that is what it used to be, right? Our Punjabis would still try to show up. Perhaps we have more than what we appear to be, what we actually have in our pocket. But in most of India, people try to hide their wealth. In Punjabis also, when it comes to tax paying, they would only report like 1/10 or 1/5 of this. So if you're saying that, in 10 years, from 100, the number of very rich has gone up to 1,100, so it actually might be 11,000, right? So we all know, even our neighborhood, our own kind of relatives, perhaps, so they also would not reveal their wealth. They'll not reveal their income also. So being wealthy becomes kind of trendy, and it, in some sense, also get kind of embedded in our culture through the idea of small wealth. And there is also, at some level, policy level, new narratives. For example, earlier government used to create employment through public sector, through various other positions. Now what is celebrated is self-making, startups, something like Dalit capital. There's a new narrative which has now become kind of defunct, but everyone will say, why should you look for a job in the government sector through reservation? You become an entrepreneur. And when you become an entrepreneur, you would not ask for job, you will give jobs. I mean, as if it's so easy to become entrepreneur and you'll be able to give jobs. But that's how it is. It is kind of new language which becomes a language of common people. And the state then also begins to withdraw, that I will only give you 10 lakh rupees, 5 lakh rupees, self-making, you become a startup. And then you begin to celebrate those startups. Some of them actually become successful. But if you look at the number of people who actually fail, there would be. So when we thought about it, that if we have to study wealth relationally, how should we do it? And in case of India, various countries adopted different strategies. Vamsi and I had a lot of discussion with our team, Purendra, and there was a team in Calcutta, in Chennai, in Bombay and Delhi. So we decided to kind of think of wealth from an old perspective, which is called as political economy, historical, sociological kind of perspective. And we thought that we need to look at wealth from a spatio-historical perspective, that it is not something that India has wealth. Who in India has wealth? Where is wealth concentrated? Who are these people? So we look at historical processes of wealth making, wealth becoming, and spatial processes. And spatially, there are very significant differences. So we thought about spatial and historical. And then we thought about, city as a region. That wealth is always concentrated in city. And you were talking about agriculture versus city. Agriculture is also an urban process in many ways. I work on that, and that's something that we can discuss at some other time. So city becomes the point where a regional economy grows. And this regional economy has its own dynamics, and where, along with regional economy, political power is also concentrated. So cities are site where ascription-based identities are consolidated. We normally have this kind of understanding that, only in rural areas people believe in caste system. In urban areas, everyone becomes individualized. If you look at the history of caste, it is in urban context from late 19th century onwards that caste begins to reproduce itself through caste associations. Even now, you look at the Kamma caste or Reddis or Brahmins, all their associations are urban center. So caste is the place where culturally, politically, economically, a region articulates itself. So we thought, city would be the place where we can look at wealth processes, and we decided to kind of look at diversities of India. We identified 4 regions, 4 cities regions. One was Hyderabad, then Calcutta, NCR, Delhi, and Bombay. There are other regions also, but we thought, this is the max we can do. And these are very, very diverse regions. I'll try to wind up soon because rain might come. So, as Vijitra was saying, it's very difficult to map wealth. We started with some kind of methodological process, but when we actually looked at the process of mapping wealthy, there's one list available, but even those people who are listed, you can't access them. If you ask for an appointment, it's very difficult. But our researchers did that, and then we kind of, Purendra suggested that, we have lots of journalists who would tell us. So, for example, if we have listed wealthy in Hyderabad 100, but Purendra knows that apart from 100, there are 3,000 or 4,000 else who have at least more than 100 crores. And 100 crores is good enough, right? And you can easily identify 70, 50. So every region identified 80 people who were wealthy. And then we tried to kind of build case studies. So we did a kind of fictitious survey. We made a list of wealthy people and then tried to identify their attributes. And some of this is there in the reports, and those reports are they are available on the website. If you go to this Inequality Center, and you'll find these. So we have these lists, and I don't want to go in number without the table. But the broad conclusion that emerged is that India has seen a significant expansion of private wealth during the 90s or post-90s period, and there is mainstreaming of wealth. Being wealthy is culturally not only acceptable, it is also celebrated. It's also seen as a great thing, and that's something which is evident the moment you go on any road of the city, the kind of buildings and malls and all those things that you have. There is also a kind of social expansion or expansion of wealth. What do I mean by social expansion? That there are many more people, if you look at kinship categories or caste categories, who have become wealthier, right? Their number has increased. But that, in some sense, increase is qualified by processes of exclusion, right? And these exclusions are of two kinds. And most of these exclusions are ascription based, in the sense that they are based on who you are. You talk about Dalit millionaires, but we did not find a single Dalit billionaire. If you were to make a list of these 1,000 crore walas, there is hardly any Dalit. They are most of them are men. But there is also another kind of caste class process in Hyderabad region, which Purendra will talk about, which did not have a very powerful Baniya community or trading castes. It was very easy it was easier for people from agrarian background to come and get into big wealth and rise above. In North India, which was, in some sense, Punjab was center of Green Revolution, it doesn't happen because there's a very powerful Baniya community there. In Calcutta, again, it's very interesting. The Bhadralok Calcutta elite see wealth as sin. They are very kind of, culturally hung up on being educated. If you have money, if you have wealth, that means you are not Bhadralok, right? So people who become wealthy in Calcutta are mostly Marwadis. Now there is, in last 10 years, there is a kind of expansion of, other trading castes which are outside Calcutta. They are coming into wealth through political process. So Bombay, obviously, we don't need to say anything where wealth expansion happens. But so most of the new wealth expansion happens either in the traditionally privileged caste communities or among those who are upwardly mobile agrarian communities, and they come into urban areas and become wealthy. Hindi heartland, which is kind of the largest part of India, is barren. There is hardly any big wealth. If you go to Madhya Pradesh, most of UP, Bihar. Bihar is a very strange place. Patna is itself not a million plus city. And you would not find a single wealthy person in Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, or even Rajasthan perhaps. So there is this kind of, and all big wealth is urban, right? We used to talk about semi-feudal mode of production, rich landlords. None of the landlords, people who have big wealth, they might also have agricultural land, but the source of their being wealthy is not in the village. It is all in the city, and this is a very significant change which we all think it is accepted, but it also has other political implications. Caste and other ascriptive identities become very important for wealth to reproduce itself, not only through kinship networks, as people like Bourdieu would call, but also as buffers. These identities are mobilized as buffers, and then through that they also become politically active. And whenever there is crisis, and this is a bigger point which I can't elaborate because we have. So, but there is very important that to think of wealth purely in class terms or class process would be misleading. There is also this whole kind of very interesting intersection with caste and community. Muslim wealth, for example, has been shrinking for obvious reasons. The old Muslim elite have died out, and it's very hard for new Muslim elite to come up. The Sikhs are also not there too many. There are some of them are there, Christians are there, but again, there is a kind of regional spread, but again, the main Hindi heartland, which you would call as North Indian Hindu upper caste, they are there, but not from their own region. So wealth is also generally not acquired through competition and merit. So the processes are also non-competitive processes. There are more complicated processes which we need to study, and I think I will stop here and to just conclude by saying that this is a new area, this is an emerging area, and I think there's a lot to do in this area. So I think there are lots of autobiographies of wealthy available, but micro processes, even single case study, would make a very good PhD thesis. And I think these are things that we need to do. Look at then question of wealth and power. Journalists are talking about it, but academics are not really operationalizing those questions into hard questions. Some of the work is being done. There are global scholars, some 2-3 volumes have come up and they have published it. But this was in some sense a very early attempt, and we look forward to hearing from Ram what he thinks about our work. Thank you so much. Sorry for taking a little more time.
Okay. Let me first thank Anant, HUL, because I think he was generous in coming forward to host the event, because this is part of a larger project that we were, I think, as Vijitra and Surinder were saying, across the 3 countries and also in each country across the cities that this study was conducted. All of these actually have been brought out as working papers which are available in the public domain in the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. 4+1, 5 city, 5 reports from India, Brazil, and South Africa. All the reports are online available in this website. So today the purpose is, we also thought we want to actually disseminate some of the key findings, generate some kind of a discussion, and provoke some of these formulations that we also are thinking about. Broadly speaking, in terms of mapping the wealth elites, as both of them were trying to say, studying the top or studying the elites, I think, is a very challenging task for various reasons, because I think social science has been more familiar in studying inequality, discrimination, poor, and village and neighborhood. But I think studying the rich and studying the super rich and ultra rich individuals is not an easy thing, which methodologically we did actually try and innovate in many ways in terms of studying the ultra rich. And more importantly, studying the rich is also about understanding the processes of exclusion, processes of who gets actually privileged, who gets disadvantaged, and who has access to state and other institutions. I think these are processes that we were trying to actually look at. But broadly speaking, I think I have to summarize what we have done. Hyderabad city region is something that's the basis on which I was involved. So I will actually indicate the key findings and how we went about the study, etc. In terms of Hyderabad city region, okay, because I think it's not Hyderabad city, but I think invoking Edward Soja and others, how these regional social structures actually become sources of wealth and accumulation that stretch beyond the region, that actually tell us much beyond the existing regions. So taking that into account, we were trying to look at. So when you look at the normal kind of data sources and statistical and other wealth indicators, that Hurun Rich List or Knight Frank and other kind of reports, all of that was indicating that what Surinder was saying, from 2012 to 2022, in Hyderabad city, the billionaires grew from merely 3 to 78, which is a huge kind of a jump in a span of 10 to 12 years, from 3 billionaires to 78 billionaires. And when you look at these ultra high net worth individuals, the reports actually indicate that after Bombay, Hyderabad actually occupies the second place in the country in terms of having ultra high net worth individuals. So in our own field data, what we have done is methodologically we did three kind of steps. First thing is short survey, which is what is actually just a one-page kind of a survey. Just the name of the primary wealth owner, what's the company, what is the cost, and what are the business kind of activities that primary wealth owner has. Just minimum kind of details. We try to take it from whatever publicly available kind of data sources, and we also took from regional kind of things like Andhra Jyoti, had business kind of sector, or Inadu, Chappalanundi, or YouTube kind of sources. We took all that kind of sources and also cross-checked with some of these Economic Times and other journalists in terms of their costs of the primary wealth owners. We have about 284 primary wealth owners in Hyderabad city region. Hyderabad city region includes both Telugu states, North Coastal Andhra, South Coastal Andhra, Rayalaseema, and also North Telangana and South Telangana. So all the 5 regions. Because we were very keen in following up this region and sub-regional story, primarily because regional political economy and political kind of networks are very, very different in each region. So we were trying to do that in terms of each of these regions to look at. So we prepared the 284 primary wealth owners through the short survey. And then we had a long survey in terms of more variables. But we looked at Bombay Stock Exchange data. We looked at some of these red herring reports, the company annual reports, and fundu.com, and different kind of multiple sources to look at the longer kind of a survey. We have about 82 primary wealth owners in that long survey. And we did third one case studies, 8 case studies, very detailed kind of case studies whom we were able to access through this LinkedIn. Because initially when we sent the email, nobody was responding. But 1 month free, this Prime LinkedIn got us actually some access to the big primary wealth owners who gave the interviews actually, and then I were able to follow. I myself did 8 primary wealth owner case studies. So when we look at all this data, what indicated was what is available in the public domain in terms of all these wealth reports actually is gross underestimation. What is being talked about 78 actually is gross underestimation, because from our 284 sample, we have more than 118 billionaires. So that is one. Second thing is there is a lot of undisclosed wealth and non-listed companies. And when you include non-listed companies and the undisclosed wealth, it is at least 3 to 5 times higher than what we actually were able to estimate. So that was one other thing. And then what we did was to look at this whole field data that we analyzed. As Surinder was saying, we also wanted to look at the historical kind of trajectories of each region. So we looked pre-colonial, colonial, and then post-independent period. So we looked at each of these regions, like Hyderabad state, and then we also looked at coastal Andhra, South coastal Andhra. So we have actually trying to link the dots to see how do we understand the contemporary kind of wealth cultures and wealth processes that are actually unleashed in the post-90s or post-95. Okay? So I will not have that kind of a time to go in, but when you look at the Hyderabad, for instance, okay, diamond trade was one of the important kind of a thing that actually helped Nizam amass wealth. The way Nizam actually, integrated a lot of these elites, particularly the Gujaratis, Goswamis, Marathis, and then the way moneylender kind of elites and the sector from Bombay, which played a very important role, how Leonard and others actually try to tell us that how these whole political elites during the Nizam period were very powerful because they were holding the land and revenue. So those things, along with C.V. Subbarao, who also wrote on Hyderabad city, I think tells us that small-time traders, contractors, and assorted professionals also played a very important role in constituting the elites. From there to early 19th century, how these Gujaratis, Marwadis, and Goswamis were able to actually accumulate more through the adoption, and other processes, marriage and adoption and other processes that help, and then to move to the towards the independence, especially police action. Police action was very important in Hyderabad state, where a lot of elite actually migrated to US and other North European countries. And in the post-independent period, when we looked at the competition that was actually ensuing between the Muslim elite, Hindu elite that were in 70s had to compete with the coastal Andhra elite who came from the agrarian kind of surplus and green revolution. One of the key insights that we got from Harish Damodaran was that, in North India, Baniya capital was very strong, while in South India, actually the trader and the Komati or Vaishya capital is not as powerful or strong. Therefore, some of these peasant communities from Green Revolution were able to actually, enter into first rice mills, oil mills, from there actually moved on to sugar factories and then to other kind of things. Of course, by 1930s, you had, Andhra sugar mills, you had Saradi studios, you had, the Challapalli Raja and other kind of people who have diversified, because money lending was no more, feasible or viable by then. So when you look at those trajectories, and then in the 80s, that a lot of coastal Andhra capital actually came, and that actually is an important dimension, that how the Vaishya vacuum or Komati vacuum that Kalairasan and Vijay Bhaskar talk about, that vacuum was actually filled by the agrarian communities and the agrarian surplus, which invested into these cinema industry, engineering colleges, healthcare sector, pharma sector, and all that. Now, I don't think I'll have time to actually recount a lot of the stories, but what I will do is, I will quickly move to key findings. Okay? When you look at 95 to 2014, I think is the very critical phase in which during this reform period, a lot of wealth accumulation, wealth consolidation, wealth reproduction actually took place. So there are 5 sectors which are very prominent. One is pharmaceutical sector. Second, of course, IT sector. So then the third one is real estate, then manufacturing sector, and the service sector. So when you look at these 5 sectors, there were something like 4 broad trends one could see. First one, in terms of manufacturing sector and in terms of agro business, the agrarian elites actually who diversified, a lot of surplus came from agriculture and they diversified, and that's how from the manufacturing and agro business sectors actually these elites emerged. When you look at the pharmaceuticals and IT sector, it was largely agrarian, non-agrarian, and the urban elites. All 3 kind of elites actually were significant. And when you looked at, the other distinction was there were a lot of these tech-based professionals and IT professionals who returned to India. After whatever wealth that they accumulated, they did not actually only invest in their own domain knowledge. They also diversified into non-domain. So a lot of them invested into media companies and education and health and whole set of those things. Okay, so these were broad trends, but pharmaceutical sector I think is one of the very important things, because in the entire global Hurun rich list, top 100, you have 3 pharmaceutical company primary wealth owners who actually figure in the top. Okay, and when you look at more closely in terms of that pharma sector, it clearly indicates that first one, particularly Divi Laboratories, okay, where Divi Laboratories actually has niche product like generic API, that is this active pharmaceutical ingredients, where they have a very niche kind of a product that they were selling it in the global market. And Murali Divi who is now the richest Telugu person in the entire country. Okay, and that's one sector is pharmaceutical sector. And when you look at other companies like Arabindo, or you look at the hetero, in a very short span, I think these companies actually were able to get a massive kind of a wealth. That's primarily because of state patronage and in terms of their access to the caste networks. Okay, and the third one that you can see is pharmaceutical sector. A lot of them actually did not have, they were largely drawn from these elite institutions, from their professional qualifications, etc. Large part of them came from these ready laboratories, and previously the public sector company called IDPL, which provided the basis for most of these people to become entrepreneurs. So you have a very different kind of trends in pharma sector, which today I think, in the entire country, Hyderabad seemed to be the hub of, the pharma bulk drug industry. When you go to the hospital industry, interestingly, it is the doctor entrepreneurs. Okay, if you look at our KIMS Hospital, Rainbow Hospital, Global Hospital, Max Cure, or any of these, all of them actually are doctor entrepreneurs. They started in 80s, mid 80s, these medium and corporate kind of a hospital. They all come from one district, that is Nellore. They all belong to one caste, that is Reddys. So you have actually regional kind of a network and caste, how they consolidate to actually produce certain of these, hospital kind of a network is something that one could actually see. And then when we looked at the competition between regional capitalist class and the national capitalist class, you found that, in terms of cement and manufacturing industries, in terms of, infrastructure projects, particularly GMR, the GMR projects in North Coastal Andhra, okay, there was a huge competition in the 90s and 2010 where they were able to outcompete the national capitalist class. Adani was not able to win the bid. Both the Rajus and GMR actually outcompeted. It's a different story today in the current regime, that the whole thing was actually sold off at a very low cost. But the point is, the regional capital actually had a very different kind of access to state, access to bureaucracy, access to banking kind of a network, which I think that regional and sub-regional stories, I think, are very interesting to understand the political and the economic processes. And then when we move to, there is, it's not only rising wealth, but also falling wealth. What Surinder was saying, if you look at Hyderabad particularly, the Muslim elite is one classic example where the falling wealth, where, in the post 80s and 90s, you find a drastic kind of a fall among the Muslim elite. Similarly, you have Satyam Raju, who is actually another case of falling wealth. Pennar Cements was another case of falling wealth. Okay, so with the different political regimes, you have different kinds of dynamics playing out. Who would actually be, up and who is actually going down? I think these are important kind of dynamics. Then you have state as a source of corruption. See, the accumulation dynamics also took place primarily in terms of, when you look at state, earlier Nagarjuna Sagar project, then of course Jalayagnam, and now in the current regime, 2014 to whatever, Kaleshwaram and Polavaram projects have been the major source of corruption, which has paved the way for huge accumulation dynamics that actually one could see. Okay, so that's another dynamic that we were able to actually look at. But also there are new kind of wealth accumulation spots that are emerging. Okay, in terms of aquaculture industry, in terms of horticulture, in terms of digital based kind of tech companies, e-commerce, and other companies, which are new hotspots which are emerging. And if we have to understand, we also have to look at both old elites and new elites. Interestingly, whether it is new hotspots or old kind of industries, it is the same upper dominant castes which are still at the helm in both the spaces. And you have, of course, a very small proportion of upper class OBCs who are able to make it, but otherwise you hardly find lower class OBCs, SCs, STs, and Muslims. And interestingly, women, according to the statutes and mandatory kind of provisions, there is only one women director that is required in the board of directors. So invariably, it is only symbolic kind of one mother or sister or wife's name, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of looking at the women actually in the business sector. So that marginal spaces in terms of not only Adivasis, Dalits and other communities, but women actually is something very significant that we saw in this particular thing. And of course, we have what Surinder was saying in terms of Dicky. Okay, a lot of active kind of measures, especially in Telangana. I think a lot of Dalit organizations actually advocated for reforms, for accessing credit in banks, because I think one of the important sources of difficulty for even a small segment of Dalit entrepreneurs was they can't get collateral. It's very hard to get credit in the banking institutions, and therefore they were actually advocating how state can actually step in to do that. But still, I think some of those dynamics we captured. But I think I'm already, Anant is looking at me that I have exceeded my time. But all this report is available in the working paper. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm not a teacher, so I will sit and speak. Okay. I'll be a bit brief because we need to have time for questions. I first, what I'm going to say is based on a reading of the national report, plus a reading of the Hyderabad city region report. There are also reports on Delhi, Kolkata, and Bombay, which I have not read. The first thing is that, there has been a lot of study recently in the past 5-10 years about inequality. It all began with Piketty's work on wealth inequality, and that is kind of picked up in other parts of the world, including there's been quite a bit of work by Piketty's colleagues and others on India more recently as well. But where this study, the set of studies is different, is while all those studies have been done by economists who are essentially deal with numbers about wealth inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality. This is a broader study. There are sociologists involved and economists as well. But these studies seem to be looking at processes, not just at how many rich there are, but also how this wealth has been created. And they situate this understanding of wealth and inequality in a caste and community networks broadly in a social setting, and give you a historical understanding about the development or evolution of wealth, not even evolution, I have something to say on that, on how wealth was generated and created over the centuries. The studies go from pre-colonial times to colonial times and then the post-independence period. So in that sense, these seem to be very distinctive studies which are in a way richer than the ones that we have seen, and perhaps take the study of wealth and inequality to a different level. It's also an ambitious project, and there are of course numbers which go slightly in a different direction from what existing studies of wealth and inequality have done. They have their own definitions of super wealth, wealthy, and what they also call fuzzy wealth. I won't get into that. But what they do have, as I said, is a very detailed historical understanding of the creation of wealth, and putting it in a supplemented with, as Punendu said, Hyderabad, I'm sure there will be in the other cities of individual case studies. There are of course no names mentioned, but they're all anonymized. But there are individual case studies. Now, one point that I would like to make, as Surinder said and Punendra also, inequality has always been with us. India has always been an unequal society. But what is different now? There seems to be a qualitative change. Okay, earlier, immediate post-independence period, um, there was, you wouldn't talk about it. There was a certain hypocrisy about it as well, that, nobody would talk about wealth. Of course, there were very wealthy people at that time. But now, again, as Surinder said, we celebrate it. I mean, anybody who watched the social media feed on the Ambani's wedding would know that there were more people approving and excited about it than those who were critical of it. So there is a celebration of wealth. Besides that, what is, I think, is qualitatively different is that the process of creation of wealth has dramatically changed. And I'll just elaborate a little later. And it's not just a post-liberalization phenomenon. There's something more. I would say that it's something over the past 20, 25 years. I'll kind of come to it. They think, how do we understand this qualitative increase in wealth and inequality? You see, since they wrote the study, they say that India has the fourth or fifth largest number of dollar billionaires. This morning I checked, according to the latest list, we are now third. Okay, so what should worry us is, why is it so? This is a country where, it has more dollar billionaires than France, Germany, UK, Japan. Our per capita income is about, France's per capita income is 20 times that of India's. Okay. And yet we have the third largest number of billionaires. Of course, China has much, 4 times as many dollar billionaires as we have. Now, is it just that we are the large economy? Of course, we have been growing the past 20 years, and therefore we have so many billionaires. I'm not so sure. I don't think it has to do with the size of the economy or liberalization. And there I would say that what is different is perhaps I would like to, put it very broadly as a state capital nexus, which has always been there. We know how the Ambanis made their money in the 70s, 80s, which had a lot to do with access to the state machinery. But in the past 20, 25 years, I think this has become extremely close. It is not talked about, but it is there in front of us. How did Adani become the biggest conglomerate? How did Ambani's build on their past success? It has a lot to do with what I would suggest is a state capital nexus, which has to do with preferential contracts. You may not have licenses as before, but how did Adani get all those airport contracts? It had to do with access. It had to do with civil contracts, highways, irrigation. You spoke about it, ports, airports, and somewhere what we don't talk about hush anymore, also defense contracts. So I think, I am not denying, how the IT business grew, how IT billionaires made their money, how the pharma industry grew. But there is something more underlying this growth of extreme inequality. Now, I just leave one thing over here. When I talk about state capital nexus, you look at the states where the largest number of billionaires are. Maharashtra, your Hyderabad region, and I would say Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Now, those are also the states we see a huge amount of spending during elections. Okay? You're talking about 100, 150 crores per candidate in a Lok Sabha constituency. So there is a connection. There is a connection between the state capital nexus, which feeds into election finance. The richest MP in the Lok Sabha, I think, is an MP from North Andhra, right? Whatever his name is, I forget, So it's not only a fact that MPs are very rich, but they're part of this network. And so you have the state giving preferential treatment to capital and capital feeding political people who are often big businessmen as well. Now, let me very briefly talk about Purnendu's study of Hyderabad. He's already covered the main points. And what I found interesting was that his, you know, delineation of the caste and community networks. I was particularly taken aback by the fact, you probably know it, but I didn't know, that most of the private hospitals in Hyderabad have been set up by Reddis from Nellore district. So there is a region specific and community specific connection. You also have this interesting classification that agrarian elites have moved into manufacture and agribusiness, non-agrarian into real estate and construction, and the newer elites into pharma and IT. You spent some time talking about the pharma. But here again, while you do mention, you talk in your study about YSR civil contracts, or more recently, how in Telangana the contracts for the irrigation projects went to the developers, and then in Andhra they went to the Reddis, Reddis or Kammas, one of the two. Here again, I'm not sure that we are giving sufficient acknowledgement to this, what I call the state capital nexus. You mention it, but it would seem that the transformation of wealth or growth of wealth in Hyderabad in the past 20 years has a lot to do with these civil contracts in various areas. Yes, pharma, IT, etc. But this is something else, and they have had a kind of negative impact on politics. Some of the other points you see, Anand, look, I'm more or less done. So that's one thing I wanted to put out there, that about what I call about the state capital nexus. The second thing is something, as both of you are speaking, are we conflating entrepreneurship with wealth and inequality? Wealth and inequality, extreme wealth and inequality is a normative thing we need to be worried about. It's an ethical thing we need to be worried about. But entrepreneurship is something different. It's part of the process of capitalist development. So when you're talking a lot about how the pharma industry grew and all that, I was wondering whether we should keep a distinction. You see, the problem, as again the report says, inequality has grown in India because of, for example, not just the black economy, but because of the abolition of wealth tax, the abolition of estate duty, etc. So all the conditions for concentration of wealth are there, okay? But there is also an entrepreneurship that is going on, as you even talked about Dalit entrepreneurship, etc. So whether we should be aware that the two are distinct. Two final, just methodological points. I wonder whether you shouldn't have studied Bengaluru also. Because in some ways, Bengaluru and Hyderabad are both similar and different. And when people talk about Bangalore, they talk about IT. No. The reason why there is so much corruption in Karnataka is because of the wealth that is created through these contracts. So perhaps in your next round of study, you could look at that. The second thing is, a lot of the studies on wealth and inequality done by Piketty and others have been criticized by the mainstream. In a sense, it's the empire striking back because of methodological faults, etc. I wonder, I'll put it to you, whether when you publish it, for example, you said you've used your own methodology to show that the extreme wealth in Hyderabad is not 78, but 118, etc. That at least one case study you can list in detail, anonymize, perhaps with the permission of your interviewee, how you got all that information. Because if you say that I spoke to journalists, I looked at websites and all that, immediately I'll say that no, that's not social science, that's all impressionism. It may help if just one, you put everything out there and say, look, we took this secondary data from this published source, we took this from personal interviews, etc. It may help to establish greater credibility. Yeah? But at the same time, I'm really fascinated. You said you got to, I was wondering how you got to speak to these people. Normally, they will not speak. perhaps LinkedIn, or I don't know how you flattered them or whatever. But it's really interesting that you were able to conduct proper interviews. Okay, I'll just stop there. I'm sure there'll be many questions. Just to end by saying this is really a fascinating set of studies. I've read only two of the reports because it's multidisciplinary and it's not just about numbers. And as I said, it deals with processes. You know, it is not just coming up with inequality was so much or there are so many billionaires, etc. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for sticking to time. We have about a hard stop at 6:45. So we have about 20 minutes or so, no more than that. As the chair and host, I'm obligated to say a few things. I'm just going to quickly take through 3-4 minutes to say that. Number one, just to respond to something that Ram has just said about the methodology, maybe there is something to be said for looking at some of the work that was done in geography on policy transfers. Because one of the things that we realized in 2004, 2005 is that a lot of policy was being made in places which are absolutely inaccessible for anyone. They're not being made through any of the known methodologies. Transnational state processes had set in. You can't even enter a conference without paying a $10,000 registration fee, and it's in that conference that policy best practices are transferred. So there were methods that were devised through all kinds of techniques to figure out how to tease out information, and they were documented well at that time. I'm happy to discuss that with you at some point. Couple of other things that I wanted to flag is that as I was listening to all the presentation, actually reading through the texts, one of the things that kept going at the back of my mind, quick fire, was Suniti Kumar Ghosh. I mean, this is not the big bourgeoisie of India. We're talking about a completely new wealth. And I think that it'll be really interesting to see when did that break happen, why did that break happen, what happened to the big bourgeoisie that Suniti Kumar Ghosh talks about, right? There's an enormous amount of archival work that was put into writing about those kinds of people, and there was a political understanding behind that. So that's one thing I think is really important to think through. Couple of other things that I think which are also important is that the period between 1947, which is when colonialism ends and you kind of begin to enter a new world, and till 1991 is a big long stretch. It's not a continuous space at all, right? Particularly, I have always grown up to believe that the 80s is the lost decade for so many of us. I mean, we have seen the lives of people who were politically very active in the 70s. We saw what they were struggling against. We saw the rise of subaltern studies collectives. And in the 80s was when we actually saw a lot of fights unravel, right? Lots of things happening. And I think that's the moment when we really have to explain in terms of where did these new pathways emerge from. And I think that the work of, let's say, Sharad Chari on Tirupur, or you take Harish Damodaran's work on Antamir, all of this is around that period. And I think that that moment of departure as a window to explain the discontinuities is actually very, very important, because what we are hearing here is some kind of a continuity and the several continuities, and then a bunch of things that are suddenly appearing as flashes on the scene. And I think that it's important for us politically and intellectually to figure out what those discontinuities are and what they're, because they're also very sociological process. That's when you see certain kinds of violence erupting in all our cities. That brings me to the last point I wanted to make, which is that around the same time as a new interest in new wealth began, is also the time when a new interest in this thing called the precariat also began, right, across the world. And I think that's an interesting intellectual moment in all our universities. In 2012, 2013, I was actually involved in a study where we said, let's move a little bit away from this idea of precariat as a class and think about precarity as a condition. And it's a condition which is assumed by and large to be one without any kind of sociality, right? The precariat is incapable of being organized. The precariat is incapable of any politics because they're struggling so badly. And we said that maybe there is something going on in this space that we need to really examine, because maybe they're actually discovering new ways of socializing, new ways of organizing. And I'm saying this because in terms of conceptualizing, we are seeing that there is a certain sociality that we are attributing to the wealthy, the elite, and so on. And we are not saying much about the socialities of the so-called precariat of the country. And that's a very large number of people, right? And it's not just in terms of not having enough money for your next meal, but it's actually a precarious existence which has been internalized by literally hundreds of thousands of people who are acting in completely new ways. I mean, the way in which they're holding on to jobs, giving up jobs, collecting friendships, building up mobile phone contacts, so much is going on in that space. And I think it's really important for us to pay attention to that. I'll just stop there and open it up because I'm really excited to see that there are so many young people here who would have lots of questions. I'm seeing also for the first time a large number of sociologists in the audience. So please.
Good evening. I'm Mohan. I'm a professor in a B school here in Hyderabad. My question is addressed to everybody. Anybody can answer. It is in the intersection of wealth and society. We have seen several business families losing their wealth and coming down, we know, because of internecine rivalry between the family members and all that. Every day in the newspapers, we now are hearing about Modis and Kalyanis and all that they are fighting. One trend I'm seeing is that, so obviously wealth reduces because it gets split between several people and some of them are not competent, some of them are competent and all that. And we saw about how Mukesh Ambani dealt with his money and how Anil Ambani dealt with his money, all that. Okay, my question is that what we are seeing is that in the wealthy families, what we are seeing now is some new trend that the women in those families are not interested in having children. And many of them are not marrying. And so what happens to the wealth? Because generally the perception is that the rich Mukesh Ambani will give money to his 3 children. Or Dhirubhai Ambani gave money to his 2 kids. So what happens to the wealth when the societal structure changes? And today what happens is that many wealthy people's children, they are not interested in running their own companies. They would rather migrate to USA and UK and settle in Switzerland or somewhere. But they're happy with their small money. But okay, so what happens? Does this money come back to the society? That is my question. Does this money come back to the society if there is nobody to take care of the money?
Thank you so much for the panel. I'm looking forward to reading the report. I guess wealth is also, I think, historically understood as the number of people you have under you, right? It's not just about like the kind of capital, like in objects that you have or like the cash that you have, but the kind of number of people that you control or have under you. And I'm curious with especially the rise in industries like real estate or crypto or other kind of digital things that are coming up. How do we see the kind of relationship between, I guess, wealth, assets measured, and the number of people like these capitalists like have under them?
Anant mentioned young people, so I was hesitating to ask a question since there are not many young people asking. Okay, but I mean, I had. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had 3 or 4 points, I think, but many of them were sort of tangentially covered. So I'll just ask one question in the interest of time, and also since recently I co-edited a book on majoritarian neoliberalism. Question on religion, because there is in this period also there has been a rise of these new age gurus who are also very wealthy, their organizations, but also play a very important role as intermediaries between capitalists, real estate players, politicians, government also, governors and all of them. So whether that is something that as a sociological process, I think it's very important to recognize the role of these intermediaries who facilitate the process of wealth accumulation and inequalities.
The reason why I came here is to learn something new. And my question is about is the society, India as at large, heading towards any bigger crisis? After the corona, the risk taking ability of many people has increased leaps and bounds, like everybody thinking about startups across. So, is India heading for any bigger crisis?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ram, for your comments, Anant, and for wonderful questions. Uh, Let me just briefly respond to the question that Ram had raised, which is methodological question and about entrepreneurship. Uh, Point I was making is not to criticize entrepreneurship. This was about the new kind of what one should say language or new policy which is being imparted even in campuses on self-making. Right? Getting education is one thing, self-making is kind of cultivating a different kind of personality which is kind of commodifiable. So that is the focus where wealth is being celebrated and institutionalized in a very different manner. And it also legitimizes wealth as a kind of single person's achievement. Therefore, if Adanis have so much of wealth, you would not ask questions about state process. You would say that he's a self-made person. He didn't come from a very billionaire kind of family. He's self-made person. I'm also trying, he's also trying, he's successful. So he's my hero. So I think this is how ideologically wealth kind of produces a hegemonic narrative. So that's the point I was making. Entrepreneurship obviously is required. We are not really saying that capitalism is going to be kind of finished in any way. So we are not so ambitious. But that was the point being made. We are not criticizing entrepreneurship directly. Methodological challenges obviously are very, very important. I will not, there was one thing more which I wanted to comment, but it doesn't matter. Thank you, Anand. Some very, very interesting kind of useful comments. And I think about 80s, I think something that we did not deal with, but again, there are many things that come together. I mean, 80s is the time when, for example, Nehruvian project collapses. And that in some sense opens up space also for new liberal policies. But the other question that you ask, it connects with the argument that I was giving. So the way policy is being made, the kind of method that you invented, it's not being made in Delhi any longer. Many of these things are actually crafted while people are sitting in some country of Europe or New York or wherever, and then they get kind of transmitted to via IMF or World Bank or through other agencies, and they then become kind of state agenda, and you are all the time trying to live up to what World Bank is saying, and the text that all IMF economists come, they gave interviews in Delhi, and that becomes the normal kind of a point of discussion among all these rich people. But thank you very much. I think that's very important, and 80s is very critical. And I have also kind of thought about it and written about it. About wealth and society, sir, absolutely. I think in some sense, we have not really begun to think at that level. And that's where I think what Ram was saying, state has become something else. What we need to do both as a society, but also it will have to be legalized. What do you do with, say, for example, why can't we just say that if you earn wealth beyond this level, it should come for society. What will they do with more than 1,000 crores? If somebody has 25,000 crores, you say, okay, you keep up to 20,000 crores, but rest of the 5,000 crores, you put it in a different fund. I mean, countries like Germany, you have so many foundations, and those foundations are working even in India. These people don't have those foundations. They have CSR money that also they don't want to kind of, openly spent by people. So there is a very kind of vicious culture of not thinking about society. And this goes back to perhaps our caste system or whatever, the kind of, indifference that we have to our fellow human beings. And this big wealth can also be translated into something else. Why Lamakaan has to be given by just one individual? There should be every mahalla should have Lamakaan. If you have so much wealth, you can also create these processes, and that could also give you legitimacy. But they don't do that. So I think that's a very important point, and that's how we need to, as a society, think about wealth, if not to think about, revolution in the sense in which earlier people used to talk about it. And I think your question is also significant. That's what point I was making. See, the Marxian idea of capitalism did talk about concentration of wealth, socialization of production, where there's so many people working under you. But now you have platform economy. Nobody works with you. Even companies, they would say, I did some interviews 10 years back with corporate hiring managers. They said, no, we don't hire people. We hire only those who are critical for us for value addition. Rest we outsource. So every single company would have 20 different companies to whom work is outsourced. Their core staff will be like 200, but they would be employing effectively 20,000 people. So this is again interesting kind of decentralization where wealth kind of, this is a new strategy of capital, which I think we need to talk more about. Yes, Partha, wonderful. I mean, that is the kind of, I was saying that the many new subjects that why do they feel these people are more reliable than lawyers? So there is whole obviously the affect aspect of it, how, common with you can confide in them, and there's a different kind of space of comfort, and again, it's cultural, it's traditional and stuff like that. But that would be a very good topic for a PhD thesis or another study, I suppose. Crisis, we are very all the time in one crisis or the other. Yes, I mean, that's why we are doing this study at some level. That is the reason that, if we don't study wealth, if we don't study these processes, we keep studying only the poor, the marginalized, and he was talking about precariat. So their sociality is also very critical. So I think social sciences can only highlight these things. But I think these are obviously also always political questions. And these are anxieties that we also have as social scientists. That we are hoping that we will not really be in crisis and we'll be able to speak to each other nicely and sit together and have a cup of tea and not kind of look at each other with sense of enmity or hatred or indifference. Thank you for.
Yeah, methodologically, I think I completely agree that we actually have been stating upfront that below the radar mechanisms and social processes, we were able to we were trying to capture, and that's the one of the unique thing about the project. But as you said, I think the methodology need to be very clearly, systematically actually documented and aware the sources, everything is available. Maybe that's a good suggestion, and also other suggestions we will take. But just about Dr. Mohan's, Professor Mohan's question, what happens to the societal structures getting altered? In fact, when I was talking to one of these primary wealth owner, he was narrating, he was actually owner of a big corporate hospital. He gave the example of Medicity, saying that the reason for closing off that Medicity was because the third generation, the successor problem. Okay, and then he was giving a lot of examples saying that what is happening to the till second generation. I think they were able to incorporate certain kind of business ethics and caste and business ethics. With the third generation, I think the whole thing is transforming. So that's the crisis that they also, as individual primary owners, they were recognizing. And he was giving examples saying that how he was able to multiply, because in that, I don't want to mention the name of that huge hospital which now has merged with the other one. That's actually both Kammas and Reddy's actually are the son-in-laws, and both of them actually have built empires across the two states, a huge chain. And their constant kind of a question is successor problem. Okay, apart from what you have been actually also raising about larger structural kind of issues that we are trying to talk about. But other important point I wanted to say is, this one of these startup entrepreneur, Redbus, okay, he was saying that there is something called inherited network, other one is interested network. See, this inherited network, particularly what we call in terms of both inherited wealth and inherited caste, which actually contributes to significant kind of wealth consolidation. He was giving examples saying that is not only caste and kinship, but alumni associations in elite institutions actually constitute a very important basis for actually getting that red bus idea. He says that for me, that inherited network were important, but the interested party network was important for me because venture capitalists and political class came forward to support me. KTR and others actually gave money and gave some position. So these are all, intersectional kind of processes which are important for us to understand how these control over people actually happen. In terms of Partha question about religion and religious gurus and intermediaries, See, a lot of thing is in the public public domain. It is actually as gossip and as a it is a public secret. For instance, I think in Hyderabad city, Chinnajiyar Swami, everyone knows what is the role and what kind of land that he owns and who is he intermediate. But how do we actually, bring that into a research kind of a thing to document it while it is openly talked about? Okay, so you have a lot of things as gossip, as rumors, as public secret, as in terms of these intermediaries and their role. But the challenge is how do we actually also bring that into social science kind of a methodological things, I think is what is important. And the crisis and corona, I think these are best examples are Covaxin and Covishield actually were able to increase 74 times in 2 years. And Vijaya Diagnostics, one kind of a diagnostic center was able to multiply, 7 times only during 2 years. Okay? So these are all, I think, where are we heading towards the crisis is something that we can always look at, different entry points.
Yeah, so first of all, like, I'm thankful that Ramano Reddy sir, he was here. I have not seen, I have attended this project's talk. This is the third time I'm attending this. Nobody has summed up or like kind of had a view of it so succinctly as sir you did. And I'd like to thank Ujitra who has come here like representing SCIS as well as like she's on a project and she has joined us here. She has come here from Bombay. Thank you for joining us and giving us the overview of SCIS. And then, of course, Anand Maringathy sir and Anil and the whole HUL team with whom we had been in constant communication and like coordination for us to put this thing together. Um, my former professor at JNU, like Professor Surinder Jodhka, uh, thank you for being here, for giving us this talk. And of course, my supervisor, Professor Purendra Prasad, who, who has worked on this project here in Hyderabad and gave us very like interesting insights about what is going on in terms of caste dynamics. And then we have our team from SCIS from Johannesburg, Comfort and Arup, who are both constantly in touch with us for us to put this thing together. Our Department of Sociology, Geetha, who takes like evening or morning anytime she is ready to send our mails. Then Nitin here is here with us who's recording for us. And then of course Kranti with whom we were able to put this whole thing together and the whole staff of Lamakaan. Thank you. Thank you all of us for joining us. Thanks a lot.